"Why didn't you let me die?" she whispered, and the cowboy realized what she'd suffered. Jake Keller had seen many things in his time as a cowboy across the stars, but none like this. His ship, the Rustler, groaned and screeched as it fell from the sky, flames licking the hull. The desert planet below, Vexter 9, stretched out like a vast, unforgiving ocean of red sand and broken earth. The cowboy's hands gripped the controls, trying his best to steady the ship, but there was no saving it. The crash was coming. With a jolt, the ship hit the ground with a thundering crash. Everything went dark. Jake awoke to the sound of metal grinding against stone. His head throbbed, his body bruised and sore, but his hands instinctively went to the controls. The ship was barely intact, a twisted mess of broken metal and shattered glass. Smoke filled the cockpit, but he didn't have time to think about it. He had to move. The cowboy grabbed his emergency gear and stumbled out of his seat, pushing open the jammed door. His boots hit the red dust of Vexter 9 with a thud. The ship's wreckage surrounded him, half buried in the sand. He barely registered the heat of the desert sun beating down on him. As he made his way through the wreckage, Jake's eyes narrowed. Something, or rather someone, was moving. In the twisted remains of the ship's hull, he found her, a woman barely conscious, her face bloodied, her body covered in cuts and bruises. Her clothes were torn, and her dark hair stuck to her forehead in clumps. Jake knelt beside her, checking her pulse. It was weak, but it was there. His cowboy instincts kicked in. He had to get her out of here. He didn't know who she was or how she'd ended up in the wreckage, but it didn't matter. She needed help. He gently lifted her into his arms, careful not to hurt her more than she already was. Her body was limp in his hold, but her breathing was steady despite the shallow gasps. "Hang on," Jake muttered to himself. He wasn't a doctor, but he had enough survival training to get them both through this. He needed to find shelter fast. His eyes scanned the horizon. In the distance, he saw a structure, an old mining outpost, long abandoned but still standing. It wasn't far. It would have to do. With the woman in his arms, Jake moved quickly, his boots kicking up the red sand with each step. The sun beat down relentlessly, but the heat didn't bother him. It was just another challenge in the long list of things he'd faced over the years. By the time he reached the outpost, he was sweating, his arms aching from carrying her. He managed to get inside the crumbling building, the door creaking as it swung open. The place was dusty, the air stale, but it was better than being out in the open. Jake laid the woman down on the floor, his mind racing as he assessed the situation. She was alive, but barely. Her wounds needed tending to, and fast. He removed her torn jacket and checked for anything more serious. There were cuts, bruises, and a deep gash along her side. It would need stitches, but it wasn't life-threatening. Jake pulled out his medical kit, the one he always kept in his bag, and began to clean and dress her wounds. As he worked, he noticed how pale she was, how thin. Her once beautiful face was now marked with the signs of pain, exhaustion, and something deeper. He didn't know what, but something told him this wasn't just a random crash survivor. Once he finished with her wounds, Jake sat back on his heels, wiping sweat from his brow. He needed to find water. He checked his supplies. Only a few bottles left. Not enough for both of them if they were going to be stuck here for too long. He couldn't afford to waste any time. He stepped outside for a moment, scanning the desolate landscape. Nothing but endless sand, the sun beating down like an unrelenting hammer. There was no sign of life, no sign of help. He'd have to figure this out himself. When he returned to the outpost, the woman was still unconscious, her chest rising and falling with each shallow breath. Jake's mind raced as he thought of his options.
He couldn't stay here.
Not with the crash site so exposed. And he certainly couldn't carry her much farther on his own. He needed to fix the ship or find a way off this planet. But first, he needed answers. Who was she? How had she ended up here, so far from civilization? A low groan broke Jake from his thoughts. He turned to find the woman stirring, her eyes fluttering open. She looked at him for a long moment, her gaze distant, confused, as if she was seeing him for the first time. Where am I? Her voice was weak, raspy, like she hadn't spoken in days. "You're safe for now," Jake said, his voice calm. "You were in a crash. I found you. You're going to be okay." "A crash? What happened to me?" Her voice cracked and she winced, clutching at her side. "You've been hurt," Jake said gently. "I patched you up the best I could." She looked down at her wounds and then back at him, her eyes narrowing as if something didn't quite add up. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Why didn't you let me die?" He hadn't expected her to say that. It wasn't the words of someone grateful for being saved. It was the voice of someone who had suffered, someone who had given up. The cowboy didn't know how to answer. He wasn't sure if it was pity, guilt, or something else that made him keep her alive. Maybe it was his natural instinct to help, to protect, or maybe he saw something in her that made him believe she deserved another chance. But he didn't say any of this. Instead, he simply answered, "I couldn't let you die. Not like that." The woman looked away, tears brimming in her eyes, though none fell. She seemed lost in thought for a moment before finally speaking again. "Why?" she whispered, as if speaking to herself. "Why didn't you let me die?" All he could do was watch her, wondering what kind of pain had driven her to such a dark thought. He didn't know her past, but something told him it wasn't just a story of survival. It was a story of suffering, and somehow Jake knew he would have to find out. Jake Keller sat by the window of the old mining outpost, staring out into the endless desert. The wind kicked up the red sand, swirling it around in small, fierce storms. The sun was a merciless heat above him, but in the shade of the crumbling building, it was slightly cooler. He tried to focus on the task at hand, but his mind kept drifting back to the woman lying in the other room. Marissa. He didn't know much about her, only what he had gathered in the short time since the crash. She wasn't just some random survivor. No, something about her felt different. There was a pain behind her eyes, a depth to her silence. A part of him knew that helping her wasn't just about keeping her alive. It was about figuring out what had brought her to this forsaken planet, why she was here, and why she seemed so lost. He sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. The crash had left him shaken, but not as shaken as Marissa. She was a mystery, a broken soul, someone who had been through something far worse than a simple crash. She had asked him why he didn't let her die. That question haunted him. Why didn't I let her die? He could still see the look in her eyes when she asked it. It wasn't a look of gratitude, but of someone who had given up, someone who thought they didn't deserve to live. Jake knew what it was like to feel like that. He'd been in situations where death seemed like a better option. A long time ago, he had lost everything. His family, his friends, his home. There had been times when he'd been ready to walk away from it all, but he hadn't. And now, here he was, saving someone who felt the same way. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps behind him. He turned to find Marissa standing in the doorway, still weak, but looking more aware than before. Her hair was messy, her face pale, but her eyes had a sharpness to them now. She wasn't as lost as she had been earlier. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice soft but steady, "for asking you that. It was rude." "No, it wasn't rude. It's just..." He paused, unsure how to explain. "You've been through a lot. I can tell."
Marissa didn't say anything at first.
She just looked at him, as if trying to read him, before finally sitting down beside him. "You're right. I've been through a lot." Her voice wavered for a moment, then steadied. "But what you don't understand is, I don't know how to live anymore." She wasn't just talking about surviving the crash, she was talking about something deeper, something dark. He had a feeling he wouldn't like hearing her story, but he also knew he had to hear it. "What happened?" Jake asked gently. Marissa took a deep breath as if gathering strength before speaking. She hesitated for a moment, her gaze fixed on the sand outside. "I was part of a mining crew," she began. "We were sent here to Vexter 9 to extract minerals from the planet's surface. At first, it seemed like any other mission, but things went wrong." Her hands clenched into fists at her sides, her nails digging into her palms. "The colony was overrun. By them." Jake frowned. "By who?" "By the aliens," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "They came in the night. We were caught off guard. The others tried to fight back, but it was hopeless. There were too many of them. I couldn't fight. I ran." Her eyes grew distant, and Jake could see the pain in her expression. He wanted to say something comforting, but he couldn't find the right words. He didn't know how to comfort someone who had faced the unimaginable. Marissa continued, her voice shaking now. "I wasn't fast enough. I watched them take everyone. The others, they were all..." She stopped, her breath catching in her throat. "They took them alive. I don't know what they did to them, but I couldn't help them. I was too scared." Jake's heart went out to her. He couldn't imagine the kind of terror she'd experienced, seeing her entire crew torn apart and not being able to do anything about it. "So, you're saying you were the only one who survived?" Jake asked quietly. Marissa nodded, her face pale. I don't even know how I got out. I just kept running. I hid in the wreckage, and when they left, I was the only one left. She took a shaky breath. I didn't want to survive. But here I am, alive. And I don't know how to deal with it. He had heard stories of survival in the most dangerous places, but this was something else. Her guilt, her pain, it was something far beyond what he could imagine. I didn't want to die, she whispered, her voice barely audible. But I didn't want to live either. Not like this. Not after everything I've seen. Jake didn't say anything at first. He didn't know how to respond to that. How could he? But one thing was clear. She had survived, and that survival had come at a cost. Her mind was broken, shattered by what she had seen, what she had experienced. But he could help her. He could give her a chance to heal. Maybe not in the way she expected, but he could give her a chance to fight back against the darkness inside her. You're not alone, Jake said, his voice steady. I know it doesn't feel like it, but you're not. I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere. Marissa looked at him, her eyes filled with doubt. And why would you stay? Why didn't you let me die? Because you deserve better than that. You deserve a chance to live, even if it's hard. And I'm not going to leave you behind. Marissa blinked as if surprised by his words. She looked down at her hands, then back up at him. For the first time since he found her, he saw a flicker of hope in her eyes. It was small, but it was there. Thank you, she whispered, her voice barely above a breath. Jake nodded. Don't thank me yet. We've still got a long way to go. He stood up and stretched. But we'll make it. Together. Marissa looked up at him, a small, fragile smile tugging at her lips. Together, she repeated softly, and for the first time, Jake believed it. Maybe they both had a chance after all. Jake Keller had never been the kind of man to back down from a fight. He had spent years fighting battles across the stars, facing down outlaws, dangerous creatures, and even the harshest of weather, but nothing had prepared him for the silent terror that now threatened them on Vexter 9. It started with strange sounds, low growls carried on the wind. At first, Jake thought it was just the planet playing tricks on him, but then the ground shook, a deep rumble that set the walls of the old mining outpost vibrating. Marissa looked up at him, her face pale. She was still recovering from the trauma of the crash and everything that had happened before, but even she couldn't ignore the fear in the air. They're coming, she whispered, her voice trembling. Jake felt a chill run down his spine. He had no idea who or what she was talking about. He had only heard stories about the creatures that lived on the outer planets, but he never thought they would find their way here, to this forsaken world. He quickly gathered his weapons, a few old blasters and a handful of grenades. He had some basic survival training, enough to protect himself and Marissa. But this was different. Something about the way Marissa spoke, the way she reacted, told him that these weren't just any creatures. They were dangerous. Jake scanned the horizon. The wind howled in his ears and the sand whipped around them in blinding gusts, but nothing could prepare him for what he saw next. Figures moving fast across the desert, their shapes barely visible in the dust. They were alien, tall, humanoid, but with limbs too long and too thin to be human. Their faces were covered with a dark mask, their eyes glowing an eerie shade of green. They're here, Marissa said, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake could feel the weight of her words settle over him. The creatures she had told him about, the ones that had attacked her colony, they were real. He didn't have much time. He pulled Marissa close, his arm around her waist. We have to get to the ship, he said. We can't stay here. They won't let us leave. I tried to run once. They hunted me down. They won't stop. Jake's heart sank as he looked out at the approaching figures. He knew they didn't have much time. They had to act fast if they wanted any chance of survival. With a grim expression, Jake turned toward the wreckage of his ship. It was still half buried in the sand, its hull twisted and smoking from the crash. But it was their only hope. If they could get inside and get the engines running, they might be able to escape before the aliens reached them. He looked at Marissa. She was pale, her eyes wide with fear, but there was something else there, something Jake had seen before in people who had been through hell. It was a kind of resolve. She wasn't going to give up. I'll protect you, Jake said, his voice low but firm. We'll make it. Marissa nodded, her eyes never leaving the figures in the distance. I'm not afraid of them, she said, though Jake could hear the fear in her voice. Jake tightened his grip on her. Stay close, he ordered. They moved quickly, ducking behind the ruined buildings, keeping to the shadows. The aliens moved with purpose, scanning the area, their glowing eyes searching for any signs of life. They were methodical, intelligent, too intelligent. As they neared the ship, Jake's heart raced. He could feel the heat of the desert sun on his back, but it wasn't the sun that made him sweat. It was the feeling that they were being watched, hunted by something far more dangerous than anything he had faced before. Just as they reached the ship, a loud screech pierced the air, a sound that sent a chill through Jake's bones. The aliens were getting closer. Marissa froze, her eyes wide with panic. "We're not going to make it," she whispered. Jake didn't hesitate. He grabbed her arm and pulled her toward the ship, pushing open the damaged door with all his strength. They stumbled inside, and Jake quickly slammed the door shut behind them. The inside of the ship was in chaos. Sparks flew from damaged panels, and the air smelled of burning wires. But Jake didn't care about that now. He moved to the control panel, frantically trying to get the systems up and running. He needed to get out of there, and fast. Come on, Jake muttered to himself, hitting the buttons in a desperate attempt to restart the engines. Marissa stood behind him, her hands trembling as she watched the door. The ship shook as the aliens began pounding on the outside, their screeches growing louder and more frantic. "Jake," she said, her voice rising with panic. "They're going to get in. We won't make it." He was too focused on the controls. He had to get this ship running. He couldn't lose her. Not now. Finally, the engines roared to life. The ship lifted off the ground, and Jake could hear the thud of the aliens' claws against the metal exterior. They were close, but not close enough. With a final push, Jake guided the ship into the sky, watching as the planet below shrank into the distance. The aliens were left behind, their screeches echoing in the silence of space. Jake leaned back in his seat, breathing heavily, his heart still racing. Marissa was silent beside him, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and relief. "We made it," Jake said, his voice low. But Marissa wasn't listening. Her eyes were distant, her mind somewhere else. She wasn't free yet, not from the aliens, and not from the memories that haunted her. Jake looked over at her, his heart aching. "You're safe now," he said, though he knew the words meant little. They had escaped the planet, but the real battle was only just beginning. The ship floated in the cold expanse of space, the stars glimmering far beyond the viewport. For a moment, everything felt still, but the silence didn't bring peace. It never did. It only made Jake feel more alone. He sat at the controls, watching the stars drift by. Marissa sat beside him, her eyes fixed on the view, but her mind was elsewhere. Jake had seen it before, in the eyes of people who had been through too much. The emptiness. She was lost in her own thoughts, and there was nothing Jake could do to reach her. Not yet. The engine hummed quietly beneath them, a steady reminder that they had escaped. But Jake knew that survival wasn't enough. Not for her. Not for him. "We're safe," Jake said, his voice soft but firm. Marissa didn't answer at first. She simply stared out into space, as though the vast emptiness could swallow her whole. "You don't understand," she whispered after a long pause. "I didn't want to live." Jake's heart clenched at the words. He had heard them before from others, from people who had lost everything, who had seen too much death, too much destruction. He didn't know how to make her understand, know how to fix what was broken inside her. "You've been through hell," Jake said softly. "But you can't keep punishing yourself for what's happened. You're still here, and that means something." Marissa turned to look at him, her eyes filled with something he couldn't place. "You don't get it," she said. "I don't deserve to live after everything I've seen, after everything I've done." Jake reached over, placing a hand on her shoulder. "You didn't do anything. You survived. That's what counts." She shook her head, a bitter laugh escaping her lips. Surviving isn't living. But he wasn't going to give up on her. Not when she still had a chance. "You don't have to carry this alone," he said, his voice steady. "I'm here. And I'm not going anywhere." Marissa looked at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then, slowly, she nodded. "I don't know how to move on," she said softly. Jake's heart softened. "You don't have to do it all at once. Just take it one step at a time, and we'll figure it out together." The silence between them stretched for a few moments, but this time it wasn't oppressive. It wasn't filled with the weight of unspoken words or unanswered questions. It was filled with something else. Hope. Marissa looked out into the stars again, a faint glimmer of something like peace flickering in her eyes. "Together," she repeated quietly. And for the first time in a long while, Jake believed her.